that. So mspec uses lambda expressions. And if you look at it, we have established it calls it. Again, what do we have? Arrange, act, assert. In this case, I use the class name to describe the context and the action I'm taking. So I do, when entering a valid username and password, the assert, the then is the it. It should go to homepage. And I could say, it should send email. So this is the same as the equivalent of the and in SpecFlow. What is the advantage to mspec over SpecFlow? Well, first of all, it's self-contained. There is no feature file and then the generated code which then you have to manually update if something changes. It's also, personally, I feel that this is more readable than seeing attributes enclosed in square brackets spread out between 3 different methods in a class, right? You get past the lambda expressions. Those become blind to you. You don't see them. All you focus on is, when entering a valid username and password, it should go to homepage and it should send an email. Right? What this does is when you run this, and you can run this from the command line, it's got a runner if you're using ReSharper, and if you see, what it does, it removes the underscores. Right? So authenticating, when entering a valid username and password, it should go to homepage and it should send an email. And that you can print out as HTML, for instance. It has an option to print it out as HTML. You give that to your customer. And you say, this is what we talked about. This is what I have currently in the system. Do you like it? Is this what we agreed on? And your customer can see, it nicely tells him also which things aren't yet done. Right? So you can just say, this is the functional specification. When I finish the application, I have a fully functional specification that I can nicely print out if I want to. Right? So, again, it's not about the tool. It's just about describing behavior, describing context, describing it in terms that the user understands. Right? So here's a couple of things when you start doing BDD. First of all, let me show you. This is a test project, right? That's using mspec. Okay? And mspec also has the option to output things into TeamCity. TeamCity is a continuous integration server, right? So it outputs it, and this is what you get. You get a nice format of all your specifications. And you can see them all, right? So if you're using TC or you're trying to integrate with any CI server, you can have that. Okay? So that works also. Now, here's a couple of gotchas when you start with this. Whether it's SpecFlow or whether it's mspec or whatever. One question that sometimes people have is, this is outside in, so I'm starting to describe my features of my application from outside inwards. So when I start, I don't say, right, I'm going to create a business data access layer, I'm going to create a customer table, I'm going to create a customer DAO, and I'm going to create a customer invoice layer. No, I say, what do you want? And from outside, I start to drive out the features. So here, I'm creating a login page. Once I finish this login page, the next step is what? To now create all the components that interact with that login page, which could be authentication components, which could be data access components. So one of the distinctions which I say now is why I diverge from the formal or the practiced BDD is that they say that this is great for what this is kind of called the acceptance test, which I think is ironic. Because test for me should always pass. Acceptance is You know, it's redundant there. But they say, use this when you're talking to your business, when you're talking to your customer. And when you go down to lower levels, when I'm talking repositories, when I'm talking logging, when I'm talking authentication services, let's go back to traditional NUnit or MS test or XUnit and use normal unit testing. Right? So we can do BDD and TDD. Except for me, TDD and BDD is exactly the same. It's just done right. But people say, no, I do BDD for here, I do TDD for here, I use MSpec for this, and I use NUnit for this. What am I gaining by using the concepts behind what we've explained today? I'm gaining context, I'm gaining insight, I'm gaining documentation, right? Which is great for my business, which is great for my customer, that he understands. Because we're talking user interface. Now let's drill down to the repository. Okay? Drill down to the repository. Who is my customer at the repository level? Who's going to consume the repository? Who's the user interface or the user of the UI of the repository? Myself or my teammate. Right? What is bad about adding context and being explicit and describing things fully at a lower level? What? As developers, we're more intelligent than normal human beings? Well, we are. Doesn't matter. What is the problem with that? There is no problem, right? Is it too explicit? Yeah, I mean, you imagine that I write a test that says, when I have given a customer repository and an underlying database, when I call get customers, it should return a list of customers. And you're thinking, I got to write all that? Yes. Because you know what a repository is. Right? It's been beaten to death. Same as authentication services. Do you know what a program structure interface is? No, you shouldn't, unless you're writing ReSharper plugins. I didn't know what it was. And if they had described to me that when you call get components on the PSI class, it gives me a list of components that are active in the system and belong to a specific solution component, that would have helped me. But the test just said get components. What do we have to go on when we're talking about tests to see if they're valid? Do you know what code coverage is? Code coverage is what percentage of my tests cover the code base. And they say code coverage is crap. You don't need code coverage. 100% code coverage doesn't mean anything. Of course it doesn't. I can have 100% code coverage and still have the wrong tests because I didn't understand the customer. How can I validate that the code I've written in a test really is what the customer wanted? By being explicit in the test. By establishing context, naming things correctly. Because that's the only thing I have to go on to validate that the code I'm writing is what the test is saying it's doing. And if the test, what it's saying is doing, is describing the business behavior or the requirements, then that's what is valid for me to know that I'm doing things right. So, you don't need to use different frameworks at different levels. Yes, sometimes it's a little bit too explicit and you might think it's redundant, but it's only redundant for you. There are people that don't know what a repository pattern is. There are people that don't know what an active record pattern is. There are people that don't know what a singleton is. All you're doing is helping them understand those concepts. And when you come back to your code in 8 months or in 2 years and you have forgotten those domain-specific concepts of your code, it's going to help you. The other question that arises is this about integration tests? Is this about, do I no longer need to use mocks? Are you familiar with mocks? You'll find out later a little bit more into mocks. And no, it's got nothing to do with that. In fact, mocks are very important here. Because when I'm writing, imagine that I start to write this test and I say, when logging in to the home controller, giving a username and a password, it should go to the home page. Now I have a dependency which is an external authentication system. And that external authentication system eventually needs to be implemented. When do I do it? Should I now stop focusing on this test, on this specification, and now write up a specification for authentication services and then implement that? And when I get to that, when that needs to talk to a database, should I stop that and move over to the database? No, because we switch context, and switching context is not really productive. It breaks the flow. So what we do is use mocks to stop our behavior, complete one specification, finish it, and then drop down to a different one, and move on from there. Okay? On GitHub, if you know about GitHub, both on my repository as well as others, there's a lot of people using mspec. Some are using it correctly, some aren't using it that correctly. But the important thing is that most of them are adding context. What is important about mspec is that when I read this line, when I read this guy over here, I need to know exactly what context I have so that I can validate the context that it's describing here with the context that it's establishing in code. Right? So if I'm setting up an underlying database, I better describe it up there. Some people use this to say, given valid database, for instance, to add value to the context there. This should tell me exactly what the code is doing. Normally, a good practice is to only have one assertion per it. Sometimes it's not possible because we have to do implicit typecasting, etc. But normally it's good practice to have one assertion per it. If one action does multiple things, each of those will go in its own it statement. Okay? So, to sum up, it's about improving communication and understanding. That's the key things to BDD. And it's about delivering better software. Let's go back to the definition. BDD is second generation, okay, because he says so. Outside in, why? Because I'm starting from the outside features. I'm driving my design from the UI down to the individual components inside. Pull-based. Pull-based because it's based on the features that we want, on the business value that it adds. Multiple stakeholder. Why? Because multiple people intervene in the process. There's the developers, there's QA, there's customers. High automation because it's automated. And what's the most important thing is because we ask the right questions, because there's good communication, because we are describing things correctly, or to the best of our knowledge, we try and deliver software that matters. It's not about the tool, it's about the communication and about doing things right. So, that's the formal definition. My definition is just that, doing things correctly. Okay? Which is just common sense. Any questions? I'm done. Thank you.